What happens when a homeless teenager crosses paths with one of the most powerful men in the world? A story of unexpected kindness and life-changing decisions begins. Stay with us to uncover this emotional journey, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. How would you react in their place? The cold winter wind swept across the highway as Donald sat impatiently in his luxurious limousine, stranded by an unexpected engine failure. His irritation grew with every passing minute as he redialed the service company, demanding immediate assistance. His driver stood nearby, shuffling nervously, unable to fix the issue. Despite the wealth and status that Donald represented, the situation rendered them both helpless on this isolated stretch of road. From a distance, a 15-year-old boy named Jamal walked along the shoulder of the highway, his thin, worn-out jacket barely protecting him from the biting wind. His messy hair and tired eyes spoke of a life spent surviving on the streets, but his spirit remained determined. He spotted the limousine and hesitated for a moment. Something about the car's grandeur contrasted starkly with his own circumstances, yet he decided to approach. Perhaps this was his chance to find work, or at least lend a hand. "Is something wrong with your car?" Jamal asked cautiously, standing a few feet from the hood. Donald glanced up, his sharp gaze scanning the boy. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice edged with skepticism. Jamal, undeterred, replied, "I can help. I know a bit about engines." Donald raised an eyebrow and exchanged a doubtful look with his driver. With no better options, he gestured toward the car. "Be my guest." Jamal stepped closer, his hands trembling slightly from the cold. He leaned over the engine, inspecting the components with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours observing and fixing machines. Within 15 minutes, he identified the issue and made the necessary adjustments. The engine roared to life, filling the air with its deep hum. Donald exited the limousine, still holding his phone. "You fixed it?" he asked, his tone a mix of surprise and incredulity. Jamal nodded, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. "It wasn't too complicated." "How much do you want for the work?" Donald asked, reaching for his wallet. Jamal shook his head. "Nothing. I'm just glad I could help." Donald paused, staring at the boy. His world was filled with people who rarely acted without self-interest, yet here was someone who offered help freely. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. Jamal shrugged. "Maybe someday someone will help me too." Donald's expression softened, though he quickly masked it with his usual stoic demeanor. As Jamal turned to leave, Donald called after him, "Where are you headed?" Jamal stopped and looked back. "I'm trying to find work," he replied. "I want to get off the streets." For a moment, Donald stood silent, weighing his options. Finally, he gestured toward the car. "Get in. We're going to get you something to eat." Jamal hesitated but eventually nodded. As he climbed into the limousine, the warmth of the car's interior enveloped him, a stark contrast to the freezing air outside. The engine hummed steadily as the vehicle pulled away, carrying them toward the city and an encounter that would change both their lives forever. Donald and Jamal arrived at one of the most upscale restaurants in the city. The grandeur of the establishment was overwhelming for Jamal, who had never set foot in a place so luxurious. The soft hum of classical music filled the air, and the clinking of glasses echoed against the high ceilings adorned with ornate chandeliers. Jamal hesitated as they stepped inside, his worn sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. Donald placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and guided him toward a reserved table near the window. "Sit here," Donald instructed, his tone calm but firm. "I'll be back in a moment. Order whatever you want." Jamal nodded nervously and sat down. He felt out of place among the immaculately dressed patrons and the elegant decor. His tattered clothes and unkempt appearance drew subtle but noticeable glances from the surrounding tables. Ignoring the stares, he focused on the menu in front of him, though the unfamiliar names of the dishes only heightened his discomfort. Moments later, a young waitress named Carol approached the table. Her polished demeanor faltered the moment she saw Jamal. She hesitated before speaking, her voice cold and sharp. "What are you doing here?" Jamal looked up, startled by her tone. "I'm here with a friend," he replied quietly. Carol's eyes narrowed as she scanned him from head to toe. "Friend?" she said with a sarcastic smirk. "You mean someone actually brought you here? We don't usually serve people like you." Jamal swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "I'm just waiting for him to come back," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Carol leaned closer, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "Listen, kid, this isn't some charity. We don't give out free food, and you're scaring the customers. So why don't you make it easy for everyone and leave before I call security?" The harshness of her words stung, but Jamal tried to hold his ground. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said firmly. "He invited me here." Carol crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Sure he did," she said, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Look at you. You don't belong here. Your clothes, your whole situation. How did you even get past the front door?" At that moment, the surrounding tables began to murmur. Patrons cast judgmental glances in Jamal's direction, their whispers just loud enough to reach his ears. "Who let him in here?" one woman muttered, her voice laced with disdain. "This place is going downhill," another man added with a disapproving shake of his head. Jamal felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He tried to explain himself again. "I'm here because he brought me. He's coming back, I promise." But Carol's patience had run out. She grabbed Jamal's arm and yanked him out of his chair. "Enough. I don't care who you think you're with. This isn't a shelter. You need to leave now." As she began to pull him toward the exit, Jamal resisted, his voice breaking slightly. "Please, just wait. He'll be back any second." The scene drew even more attention as the other diners fell silent, watching the commotion unfold. The tension in the room was palpable, and Jamal could feel the weight of every judgmental stare on him. His heart raced as he wondered if Donald would return in time to stop what was happening. Just as Carol reached the edge of the dining area, a deep, commanding voice cut through the silence. "What the hell is going on here?" Donald had returned, his imposing figure and piercing gaze freezing Carol in her tracks. She immediately released Jamal's arm, her face flushing with panic as she stammered for an explanation. The murmurs among the diners ceased as all eyes turned to Donald, who stood tall and radiated authority. "This boy is my guest," Donald said, his voice calm but filled with steel. "And I want to know why you're dragging him out of here like some criminal." Carol fumbled for words, her confidence evaporating under Donald's scrutiny. I didn't know, sir. He looked like... I thought he didn't belong here." Donald stepped closer, his tone growing colder. "You thought? Based on what? His clothes? His skin? Or is it just easier for you to assume the worst about someone who doesn't fit your narrow idea of belonging?" The entire room was silent, the weight of Donald's words hanging heavily in the air. Carol stammered, I didn't mean to offend you, sir. I was just trying to maintain the restaurant's standards." Donald's eyes flashed with anger. "Your standards? Let me tell you something about standards. This boy has shown more integrity in one act of kindness than you've shown in your entire career here. If he doesn't belong, then neither do I." The manager of the restaurant rushed over, clearly flustered by the escalating situation. He offered a string of apologies to Donald and insisted that the matter would be dealt with immediately. Carol was ushered away, her face pale and her confidence shattered. The manager assured Donald that she would be disciplined appropriately. Donald turned to Jamal, who stood frozen, unsure of what to do. "Come on, sit down," Donald said gently. "You're not going anywhere." Jamal nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he returned to his seat. The other diners slowly resumed their conversations, though many still stole glances at their table. Donald sat across from Jamal, his expression softening. "Don't let people like her get to you," he said. "You belong wherever you want to be." Jamal looked at him, gratitude shining in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not as a problem or a burden, but as a person. The rest of the meal passed quietly, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. Donald's intervention had not only protected Jamal, but had also reminded everyone in the room that appearances never define a person's worth. Donald remained seated across from Jamal as the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm. The chatter of patrons gradually resumed, but the air still carried a subtle tension. Some guests whispered quietly about the confrontation, casting occasional glances at the pair, while others studiously avoided looking in their direction. Jamal, despite Donald's reassuring words, sat stiffly, his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on his plate. He barely touched the meal before him, though it was more food than he'd seen in days. Donald noticed the boy's discomfort and leaned forward, speaking in a softer tone than before. "Don't let them bother you," Donald said. "You're here because I invited you. That's all that matters." Jamal nodded faintly but didn't look up. "It's not just them," he admitted quietly. "It's everything. I don't belong in places like this. I've never been anywhere like this." Donald studied the boy for a moment, then placed his fork down deliberately. "Let me tell you something," he began. "When I was younger, I didn't think I belonged in places like this either. People looked at me differently, doubted me, judged me before they even knew who I was. But I learned something important. The way people see you doesn't define you. What you do, how you carry yourself, that's what matters." Jamal finally looked up, his eyes meeting Donald's. "But it's hard," he said. "People don't see past this." He gestured to his worn clothes and tired face. "They just assume I'm a problem." Donald nodded slowly. "You're right. It is hard. But that doesn't mean you let them win. You showed me who you are when you helped me without asking for anything in return. That's the kind of person who belongs anywhere." Their conversation was interrupted when the restaurant manager approached the table, his posture stiff and his expression contrite. "Mr. Trump," he began nervously, "I want to apologize again for what happened earlier. I assure you that the employee responsible has been reprimanded and will not be working tonight." Donald waved a hand dismissively. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to anyone." The manager nodded hastily. "Of course, sir. If there's anything else we can do—" "There is," Donald interrupted. He glanced at Jamal and then back at the manager. "Make sure your staff understands that dignity isn't tied to what someone looks like or how they're dressed. That's all." The manager murmured another apology before retreating. Donald returned his attention to Jamal, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Donald's defense of him had been firm and public, something Jamal had never experienced before. As they finished their meal, Donald noticed that Jamal had barely eaten. "You don't like the food?" he asked. "No, it's good," Jamal replied quickly. "I'm just not used to this kind of thing." Donald smirked slightly. "Get used to it," he said. "This won't be the last time you're treated like you deserve to be." After the meal, Donald signaled for the check and stood. "Come on," he said, motioning for Jamal to follow. Jamal hesitated, but eventually rose from his seat. They walked out of the restaurant together, the whispers of the other patrons following them out the door. Once outside, the crisp night air greeted them, and Jamal immediately felt more at ease, free from the weight of so many judging eyes. Donald led him to the waiting limousine and gestured for him to get in. "We're not done yet," Donald said as the driver opened the door. Jamal climbed in, curiosity replacing some of his unease. Donald followed, and the car pulled away from the restaurant. As they drove through the city, Donald leaned back in his seat and glanced at Jamal. "You ever had a suit before?" he asked casually. Jamal shook his head. "I've never even been inside a clothing store that sells suits." Donald smiled faintly. "That's about to change." They arrived at an upscale shopping center, the kind of place that gleamed with luxury even at night. Jamal hesitated again as they entered, his steps faltering as he took in the polished floors, shimmering displays, and the refined shoppers who barely spared him a glance. Donald, however, strode forward confidently and beckoned Jamal to follow. Inside a high-end clothing store, a well-dressed salesman approached them with a practiced smile. His expression faltered slightly as he noticed Jamal, but Donald spoke before he could say anything. "We need something for him," Donald said, gesturing to Jamal. "Something that fits him well." The salesman recovered quickly and nodded. "Of course, sir. Right this way." Jamal stood awkwardly as the salesman measured him, pulling various items from racks and arranging them neatly in a dressing room. When Jamal emerged in a tailored jacket and clean slacks, he barely recognized himself in the mirror. He turned to Donald, who nodded approvingly. "Now you look like someone who's ready to take on the world," Donald said. Jamal stared at his reflection for a long moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw something other than a struggling boy from the streets. He saw potential, a glimmer of what he could become. They left the store with several bags in tow, and Jamal thanked Donald repeatedly, his voice full of emotion. Donald waved off his gratitude with a simple, "You earned it." As they returned to the car, Jamal asked, "Why are you doing all this for me?" Donald glanced at him, his expression serious. "Because someone once did something similar for me," he said, "and it changed my life. Now it's my turn to do the same for someone else." Jamal didn't know what to say, but his silence was filled with gratitude. As the limousine rolled toward its next destination, he realized that for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost: hope. After leaving the shopping center, the limousine glided through the city streets, its soft interior lighting casting a warm glow over Jamal as he sat clutching the shopping bags on his lap. The weight of the new clothes felt surreal, a stark contrast to the tattered garments he had worn for so long. Donald sat beside him, silent for most of the ride, but his presence was reassuring. Jamal's mind raced with questions, but one stood out above the rest. Why was Donald doing all of this for him? The car eventually pulled up in front of a towering luxury hotel, its grand facade illuminated by glowing lights that reflected off the marble columns. Jamal stared out the window, his mouth slightly agape. He had seen places like this on TV, but never imagined he would step inside one. The driver opened the door and Donald stepped out, motioning for Jamal to follow. Hesitant but curious, Jamal climbed out of the car, his sneakers scuffing against the polished stone of the hotel entrance. As they entered the lobby, Jamal's eyes widened at the opulence around him. The space was vast, with a sparkling crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, marble floors that shone like glass, and an elegant fountain in the center. The air smelled of fresh flowers and luxury. Jamal felt out of place again, his earlier confidence wavering under the weight of his surroundings. Donald walked to the reception desk where a sharply dressed concierge greeted him with a polite smile. "Good evening, Mr. Trump," the man said. "How can we assist you tonight?" Donald didn't hesitate. "I need a room," he said, sliding his card across the counter. "Something comfortable, but make it ready now." The concierge nodded, quickly typing on his computer. Within moments, he handed Donald a keycard. "Your room is prepared, sir. Is there anything else we can do for you?" Donald shook his head and turned to Jamal, handing him the keycard. "This is for you," he said simply. Jamal stared at the card in disbelief. "For me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Donald nodded. "You're staying here tonight. Get some rest, take a hot shower, and enjoy the comfort. You've earned it." Jamal clutched the keycard tightly, his hands trembling. I don't know how to thank you," he stammered. "No one's ever done anything like this for me before." Donald placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me. Just promise me one thing. When you get back on your feet, help someone else who needs it. That's how the world gets better." Jamal nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Together, they walked toward the elevators, where Donald pressed the button for the floor. The elevator ride was silent, the hum of the machinery the only sound as they ascended. When they reached the designated floor, Donald led Jamal to the door of his room and inserted the key card, the lock clicking open with a soft beep. The room was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city's skyline, and the spacious interior was furnished with plush furniture, a massive bed, and every amenity imaginable. Jamal stepped inside cautiously, as though afraid he might break something. He ran a hand over the soft fabric of the couch, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. "This is yours for tonight," Donald said, standing in the doorway. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out the next steps." Jamal turned to face him, his eyes shimmering with tears. "Why are you doing this for me?" he asked again. Donald's expression grew thoughtful. "Because someone once gave me a chance when I needed it most," he said. "And because you reminded me of something important today. Kindness doesn't cost anything, but it can change everything." Jamal nodded, the words resonating deeply with him. Donald gave him a small smile and added, "Rest up, we'll talk tomorrow." With that, Donald stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. Jamal stood alone in the quiet space, taking in the unfamiliar comfort and safety. He set his shopping bags down carefully and explored the room, running his fingers over the polished surfaces, the soft bedding, the neatly folded towels in the bathroom. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of stability, however temporary it might be. Later, after a long hot shower, Jamal sat by the window, gazing out at the glittering city lights. He thought about Donald's words and about the moment on the highway when he had decided to help without expecting anything in return. That one decision had led to this: a warm bed, clean clothes, and a renewed sense of hope. Jamal silently vowed to honor the promise he had made to Donald. One day, when he was able, he would pass on this kindness to someone else in need. As he lay down to sleep, the soft mattress and warm blankets felt like a dream. His mind, for the first time in years, wasn't consumed with worry about where he would find shelter or food. Instead, he drifted off with a sense of gratitude and a flicker of hope that the future could be different. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Jamal's hotel room as he stirred awake. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. The softness of the bed, the warmth of the blanket, and the silence were so foreign to him that it felt like a dream. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and he sat up, clutching the blanket tightly. His gaze wandered around the room, taking in the luxurious surroundings once more. The shopping bags with his new clothes sat neatly by the chair, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope for what the day might bring. Jamal stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The streets bustled with activity, people hurrying to start their day. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts, and he turned quickly. Tentatively, he opened the door to find a hotel staff member standing there with a breakfast tray. The man offered a polite smile, wheeling the tray inside and setting it on the table. "This was arranged by Mr. Trump," the staff member said. "Enjoy your meal." He nodded and left, leaving Jamal to stare at the beautifully arranged plates of food. He approached the table cautiously, almost afraid to touch anything. The scent of freshly cooked eggs, crispy bacon, and warm bread filled the air, making his stomach rumble. Sitting down, Jamal ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be his last. Once he finished, he decided to call Donald as they had agreed the night before. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the room phone and dialed the number Donald had written for him. The phone rang twice before Donald's familiar voice answered, calm and collected. "Jamal, good morning. I trust you slept well?" "Yes, sir," Jamal replied quickly. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Donald said firmly, "but you can thank me by being ready in an hour. I'm sending my driver to pick you up. It's time we talked about the next steps." Jamal agreed, feeling both nervous and excited. He showered again, dressed in the new clothes Donald had bought for him, and waited by the hotel lobby. When the limousine arrived, he climbed inside, greeted by the driver's polite nod. The car weaved through the city, eventually pulling up in front of a sleek office building. Jamal stepped out, unsure of what to expect but determined to face whatever was ahead. Donald met him in the lobby, his presence as commanding as ever. He greeted Jamal with a small smile and gestured for him to follow. They took the elevator up to one of the higher floors, where they entered a large, modern office space filled with people working diligently at their desks. Donald led him to a conference room where they sat across from each other at a glass table. "I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday," Donald began, "about how you've been looking for work, trying to change your situation. You showed me something important when you stopped to help me. You have the skills, the drive, and the integrity to succeed. You just need someone to give you a chance." Jamal nodded, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. "I've been trying, but it's hard. People don't even look at me twice when they see how I look or where I come from." Donald leaned forward, his expression serious. "That changes today. I've spoken with a few people I trust. There's a mechanic shop nearby that needs someone with your skills. It's a good place to start. They're expecting you this afternoon." Jamal's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and gratitude washing over him. You got me a job?" Donald nodded. I made a call, the rest is up to you. Show them the same determination you showed me, and you'll do just fine." Jamal felt a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down, nodding firmly. "I won't let you down. I promise." Donald's face softened, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. He slid it across the table toward Jamal. "This is enough to get you started. Use it wisely. And remember, you're not alone. If you ever need advice or help, you know how to reach me." Jamal hesitated before picking up the envelope. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this." Donald stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "Good. Now go. The world is waiting for you." Jamal left the building with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The limousine took him to the mechanic's shop, where he was greeted warmly by the owner, a kind man named Mr. Harris. The shop was bustling with activity, the sound of tools clinking and engines humming filling the air. Mr. Harris gave him a tour and explained his expectations, treating Jamal with the respect he hadn't experienced in a long time. By the end of the day, Jamal felt like a new person. He had a job, a plan, and a sense of belonging. As he returned to the hotel that evening, he sat by the window once again, looking out at the city lights. He thought about Donald's words and the kindness he had shown. Jamal made a silent vow to himself. One day, when he was able, he would do the same for someone else in need. The thought brought a small smile to his face, and for the first time in years he felt truly hopeful about what the future held. This story reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can spark incredible change. What did you think of this journey? Share your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Let's spread kindness